I'm Christine Barry. I want to welcome you to Barry Campbell. We're so excited to have an exhibition by Edward Avedisian. This is our second exhibition of Edward Avedisian's painting at this gallery. The first show we did in 2013. Right after we first opened the gallery, and this is our second exhibition in our larger space now. We have focused on Avedisian's early 1960s paintings, early middle 1960s, and we're so pleased today to have Joe Avedisian with us. Joe is Edward Avedisian's son, and he is a wealth of information on his father, and we're so glad to have you today.
I'm glad to be here.
It's a great opportunity for us when we have a relative of the artist that we can ask questions about the life of the artist. I know there's so many things that I want to know. I wish I could ask him, but I'm going to ask you instead. There's not much written on his early life. He was born in 1936 in Lowell, Massachusetts, and he studied at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And when I think of the Museum of Fine Arts, I think of Philip Leslie Hale and this very old school American Impressionism style. And these paintings are so modern and so new. Were there artists in the family? What did your family do? Are you Armenian? What's your background?
Background is, nationality is Armenian through Lowell, Massachusetts, which I think is a concentrated neighborhood of Armenians for quite a few generations prior to my dad. But they were not an artistic family. They were, blue-collar working family, and I think my dad was a little bit of the oddball in the neighborhood as a painter and an artist. So it wasn't
part of your family tradition?
It wasn't a fostered family tradition.
They must have supported it because he went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, so that's, to be an artist is something different.
Yeah.
So, I think it's interesting. He moved to New York in the late 1950s. So I think we deal a lot here in abstract expressionism. And you look at these paintings and you see the switch, and all of these artists were very familiar of what had happened in the 50s, but were moving into a different tradition, wanted to be more modern about what they were doing. Your dad showed at the Hansa Gallery, which was Dick Bellamy and Ivan Karp, Tibor Denage Gallery, Robert Elkon. These are like the galleries at the time. How did he become such an art star so quickly, or what was it? Do you know anything? Did he ever tell you anything about that time?
So my perspective for all of that is, as a child, was being dragged to galleries and hanging and office meetings and all these, in reflection, amazing places. When you rewind the tapes, you're like, oh, I was there. Hanging paintings at the Guggenheim when they're trying to get the painting level and I'm trying to figure out how to get a big wheel and zooming down the whole thing. So my perspective, has grown because it's like you reminisce about all the stuff, all the people he hung out with. So I wasn't there for how his artwork evolved in that time when he was thinking. I believe when he first came to New York, there was a little bit of time in Hoboken, and then New York, and then Soho when it was empty and free. And he couldn't give the space away. He had a studio on Broadway and Spring Street.
Wow.
And as did everybody if they didn't have two, because industry had fallen by the wayside, printing and sewing and the various manufacturings, and the spaces were empty. If they weren't getting squatted, they were getting rented for $50 a month on a 30-year lease.
Wow.
So it was an incredible time for people to do what they want to do without the pressures of doing what puts food on the table, I guess. So,
And those spaces were huge. I mean, you look at the paintings and you think a studio space and people that struggle to have studio space, and they were working in these huge spaces.
Yeah, when you had a small loft, you only had 3,000 square feet. Otherwise, you had 3 floors.
That's amazing.
And I remember, these places were all strange and weird looking, but you don't have a perspective of that when you're a kid. It's only when you reflect, like, what was that place? Why was there aluminum foil on the walls? And
I saw a picture last night when I was doing research of your dad and your mother at the factory, Andy Warhol's factory, and it's the coolest photo. You want to tell us about that?
My dad and Andy were friends. I remember going to the studio, and my mom was a pattern maker and seamstress, and for one of Andy's openings, he made some fabric for my mom to construct a Brillo box dress. They worked together on that, and it was sort of just, friends and family, and so in that picture, she's wearing the dress, and my dad's in the picture, and Andy's in the picture, and you know, these things as a kid are like, oh, that's a crazy dress. What is that? You know,
Look, it's a Brillo box.
You know, and the importance, magnitude, it didn't exist then. It's afterwards, so it's great to see. It's a pretty impressive.
It's a really cool picture. It looks like a good time, and everyone looks so cool and so of the time,
yeah, the
too.
photos are always so cool from that.
And I can't help but mention that recently Amy Sillman, who's a wonderful artist, was asked to curate a show at the Museum of Modern Art and go into their vaults and pick out paintings that intrigued her.
Yeah.
And she picked one of your dad's paintings.
Yeah, that was a great surprise. Yeah, we didn't know anything about that, and randomly came across it and was like, wow. And I guess that painting was on loan from Andy's estate, or Andy.
It was a
at the
gift.
time, a gift to the museum
gift
at
in
the
the
time.
1960s. So
Yeah.
there was such a weird connection because I saw the painting and then I read the credit line and I was like, how cool is this? Like, we are champions of your father's work here, and then it makes us feel good to say, yeah, like this guy was a really good artist. He was really hot at the time, and so now we're trying to retell this story. So we're grateful to Amy Sillman for including that painting in the show, and it's still up at MoMA now, I think, for another month or so. So go to MoMA and then come to Barry Campbell. We've got about 18 of these paintings here at the gallery to see as well. For us also at Barry Campbell, one of our specialties is color field painting. So we represent Darby Bannard, we're friends with Frank Stella, Larry Poons. How did your dad fit in with them? Did he ever talk about, you know, Frosty Myers? Like, what were those guys like for him?
Well, him and Frank were good friends also. And that is also from a kid's perspective. We'd go to Frank's studio in the Village, and there was, he had made a train set for his son that looked like the window of F.A.O. Schwartz. So I didn't care about the paintings. I was 8, you know what I mean? So like, but here's this amazing train set, and me and Frank's son would be underneath connecting wires and playing trains, and they were discussing clean lines versus soft lines and color and all of that stuff. But I was too young to have like a grasp on that, and that whole scene was evolving. It was like kind of the blooming era of.
It must have been a great camaraderie. It was such a time, and I think about the Museum of Modern Art did the Op Art Responsive Eyes show in 1965, and your dad was included in that show along with the other guys I've mentioned, Bridget Riley. And so it's interesting looking at the paintings because I keep saying color field, but we can relate them to op art, this play of the eye. But what I find is that people write often about your dad's work and they call it geometric hard edge. And I think even in some of our writing, we have said that. And if you look at these paintings in person, that is not the case. Can we talk about process a little bit? Like, what are these made out of, and how do you describe them?
Well, it's funny, I think the hard edge comes from the color contrast. It's not clearly a ruler line and precision edge. It's just the pop of the colors. His process was fun because as a kid, we'd go down to Spring Street studio. At some point, it was time to mule paints from Pearl Paint to the studio and getting jars of Liquitex and how much you could carry, and I think it was Art Central on 3rd Avenue, Central Art Supply.
So these are Liquitex. We sometimes say acrylic.
Yeah, the brand was Liquitex. Yeah. And back then that was almost new technology.
Yeah.
A lot of these paintings were rolled up and wrapped up. When my dad left the city in, I think it was 76 or 77, everything got rolled up, wrapped up, and left in the attic. You know, and nobody ever saw these things for a while. So when you unwrap them, you feel like you get the smell of the 60s. Like, oh, this is like fresh Liquitex, and the colors are still there.
Are so bright
crisp,
and vibrant.
So that technology is amazing. And paintings like this, my dad would lay canvases out on the floor, and I believe it's like a watered down Liquitex, kind of a gouache thing.
Yeah,
and
you can
mold.
see back.
You know, when he was working on a painting this size, there were 5 others of this colorway getting done at the same time. There was probably one bigger, there was a medium, a small, a few watercolors, and he was you know, walking around the room.
Was he cropping them afterwards? Or they cropped?
Sometimes they would get painted on stretcher, and that you can usually tell by the wrap of the thing. And then sometimes no, sometimes he would, you know, frame it or choke up the stretcher a little bit. And I remember then, you know, I was helping my dad stretch paintings and, you know,
Oh yeah.
stretching and stapling.
You still stretch a good painting. Lots of work.
And I'm a master.
Well,
Harder than stretching is unstapling.
Yeah, that's no fun.
Terrifying.
No fun. But I agree, these colors are so vibrant and bright. I hope you'll come visit because really to me, like this area, you cannot see in a photograph in a little thumbnail where it's these sort of waves of color. It's not imperfect. There's definitely variations in the color and the surface and sort of where it's thinned out. You can almost see the drips. Sometimes you can see pencil lines. This one not so much, but there's a negative space that's really important in these. They're really strong but subtle in a beautiful way, and I can see why he was so important at the time, and this is why we want to show these now to sort of bring him back to the light. But as we've done our research and worked with you over the years, there was a shift for your father, both personally and with his artwork. Your parents got divorced and he moved to Hudson, New York, and he came out as gay. And his style of art changed. And I feel like there's not much about this. No one has really talked about it. So are you willing to?
There was a whole period of time, I think, leading up to where everything was getting very, not corporate, but very busy, and it started like a feeding frenzy, and there was this real shift. Like all his friends, and him included, were just becoming stars, and this whole movement was coming to the surface. And then, you know, with on personal levels and emotional levels, all the other things going on, at a certain point, I think he felt he didn't like where it was going as far as a game, and it was a little bit thing, and he just kind of wanted to just paint and not be pushed. There was a point where a bunch of decisions were made, and he was looking about when they were separating. It was a toss-up. In fact, 2 buildings across the street he looked at and was almost going to buy back when that was $60,000.
In Chelsea.
You know,
Now it's $60,000 a month.
250 feet of frontage was $60,000. This area was abandoned. It was abandoned industrial thing. He looked at a space in the garment district. There was a whole top floor on 7th Avenue. And then he looked at this place in Hudson. And what's this town in Hudson? Oh, and there's a train that goes to Hudson. He opted for Hudson.
Which is so cool right now. Hudson is like the hip place to live. He was like one of the early ones to Hudson.
He was early, and then a lot of his friends started coming up. He was friends with John Ashbery, and there was a whole bunch of artists that kind of moved up into that area also. And that kind of became like a fashionable thing, and it's obviously that he's not the reason Hudson became Hudson, but Hudson really, you know, having the train, now it's only a 2-hour train ride or less. Back then they were working on the tracks and it could take 2 hours or it could take 4 hours. When he moved up there, he really kind of tore up his New York City art scene and retracted all the paintings from the galleries. They got rolled up, they got put in the attic, and he started painting. He never stopped painting. He was painting. But the first 5 years living in Hudson, he didn't even have a phone. So he was like, do not call, do not disturb. And there's an interesting transition from that era, because in the 70s his paintings were kind of very thick and layered and lots of paint, and then that's easy to do when Pearl Paint's 2 blocks away, and you need another 3 gallons of gesso to make a painting. And then, you know, slowly it started to change, and he sort of transitioned from the color field to sort of abstract to impressionistic to like skewed perspective color field paintings. There are paintings that he's done of landscapes up and in and around the Hudson area. A good friend of his pointed out to me, and I didn't see it until he pointed it out, but there are paintings that look like beach balls.
Oh wow.
With hay bales and sunsets, and so the technique and the method stayed.
They're representation, but they're abstracted. And I feel like they remind me a bit of Fairfield Porter or Marsden Hartley. I can see references, but they're of the landscape and of people. They're figurative and landscape. So,
and it really transitioned from, you know, there's a very topographical transition where you can see like this became that, and then he moved to here, to here, to here, you know.
I wish people talked about it more, because I feel like, I'm sure there were people that were very angry that he changed from this style to a representational style. But I can see the parallels, like you, and I think we need to show that. Like, I'd love to do a show sometime of those works.
It's also interesting. A lot of the stuff, you know, when he passed away, I start looking through old sketchbooks from early 50s, late 50s sketchbooks, and there's paintings and watercolors of figurative stuff that he then did. So the seed was there, and it wasn't a 17-year locust, it was a 30-year locust, and it all of a sudden surfaced. And it was just interesting to see how much process there was in the transition from this, and even there's sketches and paintings that are like almost graphic, like logo-ish looking art for some projects he had done. So it was interesting, you know, because it went from this posh Upper East Side art gallery and Soho, cool downtown scene, hanging with, you know, all these now luminary people who were at that point just friends, and everybody's in the mix, and everybody's, you know, seeing where it's going to stick. You know, it went from having, you know, steak tartare at 1/5 with, you know, Henry Geltzeller to, you know, buying tubes of paint in Pittsfield, you know, taking.
It must have been a relief.
It was.
And then he was living the life that he wanted. He found a life partner, Judson, and they were together for
ever, like almost 40 years.
40 years.
And he had a great big house in a town that was a rundown town that had just had an urban renewal through Main Street, but Hudson is a very juxtaposed, ghetto-y town at the time, and run down. And then now it's
fabulous.
Now you know, it seems like but that's, you know, the way New York was. Artists find, you know, no one finds good real estate better than artists. And when my parents moved to Chelsea, when I grew up on Chelsea on 21st Street, there were 4 abandoned buildings and 6 empty lots. Someone chasing my grandfather down the block with an axe because he took his parking spot. You know what I mean? The city was different. Soho, after 4 o'clock, I mean, all day it was empty because industry just wasn't there. But after 5 o'clock,
you didn't want to be around.
You didn't want to be around. It was ghost town.
It's a different time.
My dad got into these sculptures, and he was making sculptures in styrofoam, these kind of color-filled styrofoam sculptures. We'd go hunting for styrofoam in Soho, you know, like
that's so great.
Out behind electronics stores when styrofoam was kind of a
And we think maybe those styrofoam sculptures were shown at the Met.
So that was a big thing. That was an interesting point right around when my dad decided he had a one-man show at the Met. I mean, obviously not the whole Met, but he had a room.
Right.
And he decided, instead of giving them what they wanted, that he was going to do his sculptures. And it was a whole show, and it was spectacular looking, and they looked great. But it was a bit much. They looked like painted bronze sculptures that you could, that weighed 1 pound. They looked like big castings that had been painting, or you couldn't tell what they were.
And I think it's about material at this time too. I mean, you think about Richard Serra, like if you're going anti to what with painting, you're going anti to what's happening with painterly brushstrokes. You're using different materials, and the same with sculpture. So,
yeah,
and he was good friends with Frosty Myers, right? Forrest Myers.
Yep, that's that circle of friends that evolves around the infamous Max's Kansas City, and Frosty had a big role in that place because he had a laser going in and it bounced to the music in that place. And I, as a probably 7-year-old, or as probably the only single-digit age person in there, I used to go there midday.
Oh my God.
My dad would bring me. We'd be coming back from Soho to Chelsea and go there because they served baked potatoes.
Right, food. He would have food in the back. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, I was always campaigning. Can we get a baked potato? But that place, that's another one of those memories. You replay the tapes and you're like, wow, that was crazy. I mean, I remember an elephant there was a baby elephant in there once. You know what I mean? And I remember that because that's a
Yeah, I remember
memory.
that, yeah.
That really was a hub for this whole scene and movement. And obviously, I have no, other than lore, I don't, you know, I was not partaking in that
Yeah.
craziness. It was me, I was, you know, the kid there in the middle of the day, but that place was, you know,
Yeah, it was
a link to,
I
you
don't
know,
know if it's
sculptors
like that.
and painters
Yeah.
and
musicians and
everybody.
everybody mixing
Everybody.
together. It seems like even more so maybe the Cedar and Tavern was the real bar, but like Max's Kansas City was really like the club that everyone could hang.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, Finelli's was, you know,
Yeah.
always down in Soho, and you know, there weren't 400 restaurants in New York in the 70s. New York was, you know, coffee shops, a couple delis, and diners, you know, and then these weird little unique restaurants that were, you know,
Well, I'd love
artists.
to see more of your dad's later work. Maybe we can do a show sometime because I really would like to share that part of his life as well.
It could be really interesting. You could literally have a linear line, and you would think it's 20 different artists using the same color. You know, like it's.
But I see it. I see
see
the
it.
pops of color, like now that I know this, so I don't think it's that jarring. I think the
Oh, no,
relation can
absolutely.
be tied, and that's why I wanted to talk about this transition to Hudson and then the change of life, because we should celebrate that. And we would love for you to come to Barry Campbell. I'm just going to mention, we talk about Edward Avedisian as if he's not known. I think he was in 4 Whitney annuals, which is before they were biennials. Expo 67, The Responsive Eye at MoMA, many, many gallery shows. He's in the collections of the Whitney Museum, the Met, MoMA, Guggenheim. So a really stellar CV, and we'd love for you to come see these in person and see how great they are. And thanks so much for coming in today.
You're welcome.